Greetings, salutations, and words of goodwill. Welcome back to another episode on early Christian heresies. The heresy we're going to be discussing today is called Nestorianism, and it is named after a former bishop of Constantinople whose name was Nestorius. So a Nestorian is then just a follower of this individual whose name is Nestorius. Nestorius became bishop of Constantinople in the year 428. He was a monk from Antioch, and when he was made Patriarch of Constantinople, which is close to Antioch, but obviously not the same place, it was much to the chagrin of some of the local clergy who wished themselves to become the Patriarch of their own diocese. And he immediately went to work condemning large swaths of people who were rightly considered heretics by all estimations. But needless to say, it wasn't a sort of docile, make friends with the locals sort of move. In an attempt to undermine the heresy we discussed in the last video on early Christian heresies, namely Apollinarianism, he supports an interesting liturgical move that gets the controversy that surrounds him eventually rolling. It was common practice all over the Christian world, including in Constantinople, to refer to the Blessed Virgin Mary with the title Theotokos in Greek, because they spoke Greek in Constantinople, which in English literally means the bearer of God, so that would be the woman who gave birth to God. But in English, we typically translate this as mother of God, because, of course, if you give birth to something, you're its mother. I hope. And in November of the same year he became patriarch, his chaplain gave a sermon, presumably at Nestorius' behest, but maybe Nestorius just liked the idea and ran with it, in which he condemned the use of this word, Theotokos, to describe the Blessed Virgin Mary. And from a practical standpoint, for most people, this is primarily, as I said earlier, within the context of the liturgy of the church, right? Within the context of the ceremonies that take place publicly in the worship of the church in its churches. And Nestorius basically started to require that that phrase be cut from the hymns and the prayers, etc., etc. The initial sermon gets a lot of blowback, but Nestorius backs his chaplain with a series of sermons that, for obvious reasons, start on Christmas in 428, because obviously that's a feast involving the Incarnation, and so if you're going to talk about incarnational theology, that's when you start to do it. Although I imagine to many people who were in favor of the phrase the Mother of God, it seemed like a slap in the face, sacrilege. Now, we'll get into what ends up happening at the end of the story later in the video, but I wanted to begin by describing why it is that Nestorius would do such a thing. Like, why would you cut that phrase from the prayer books in your theology? And the reason is that Nestorius is actually attempting to be a significant battler of heresy, an opponent of heretics in this diocese. And when he shows up, what he sees is a lot of Apollinarians. Now, remember, what the Apollinarians said was that Jesus had one mind, namely the mind of the Son of God, and that that mind directed a human body, and that the way that God became man was by, as it were, becoming the mind of a human person, like, so that Jesus had a human body with a divine mind, but as long as you have a human body that has a mind associated with it, then that's a human mind as well, sort of like ipso facto. Even if it's a mind that's completely different than your typical created human mind. And the church condemned this position and insisted rather that Jesus Christ had a created, specifically human mind and a divine mind as well. Now, I should say at this point that there is contemporary argumentation about what it is Nestorius himself was actually trying to get at here, based on a manuscript which showed up from the time period, presumably written by Nestorius, which showed up on the scene, you might say, academically, at the end of the 19th century. Leave that as it may, I'm just going to attribute to Nestorius those ideas which are, properly speaking, what we call Nestorianism. even if his ideas were slightly more nuanced than that. So anyway, Nestorius has this proclamation by the church, namely that Christ has one mind which is human and one mind which is divine. And when you start from that position, there are two ways, as it were, that you can get to Nestorianism. So I'm going to describe both of those. The first is to ask yourself this question: what is a person? Right? And your answer would be, well, a person is an entity which has a mind, right? It's a seat of consciousness, you might say. And you might imply that the will is somehow necessary to that too, but that's irrelevant for our purposes at the moment, right? A person is a seat of consciousness. So the reason I'm a person and the chair I'm sitting on isn't is because there's no consciousness associated directly with the chair. The chair is not aware. So the chair is not a person. I'm a person. My wife is a person. The Pope is a person. Billy Graham is a person. Angels are persons. God the Father is a person, because those things are individuals which are, or at the very least have, as an integral part of their being, a seat of consciousness, which we would call a mind. And so Nestorius says to himself, well, Jesus has a human mind and a divine mind. And so, as it were, he has two seats of consciousness. And therefore he's two different people, right? That he's one person, which is human, and another person, which is God. And if that's the case, then, Mary's probably the mother of the human person and not the divine person. We certainly wouldn't want to say it's the other way around, right? So the phrase he prefers to use to describe Mary is Christotokos, right? The mother of Christ, or the Christ bearer, but the mother of Christ, because he wants to use this word Christ to describe the human person that is Jesus. Now, another similar way of looking at it is to say that what the church really did in condemning Apollinarianism and insisting that Jesus has a human mind and a divine mind is really to insist that Jesus has two separate natures, okay? That wasn't a formal declaration, but Nestorius is drawing that conclusion. And he says that he has a human nature and a divine nature. Now, if you go back to my relatively long video on Arianism, you might remember that nature, or essence in a certain sense of the word, is basically those set of characteristics that make you a certain type of thing. And so the assertion of the church is that Jesus has two different sets of characteristics that make him a certain type of thing. And we should note that this isn't like saying that someone is both Hispanic and male. I saw that analogy in a textbook for high school students at one point, and that's actually a really bad analogy, because in the case of being Hispanic and male, both of those natures, as it were, are subsets of human nature, right? So that one can be male in a sense, and one can be Hispanic by virtue of being human, right? Because there aren't Hispanic, and I don't want to get into transgenderism at the moment, okay? There aren't Hispanics that are not male or female. All Hispanics are either male or female. So one cannot actually be Hispanic without having male or female as another category into which one falls. And so the two natures are actually blended together in a sense, right? They're part of one nature. And the church wants to say eventually, it's not so clear at the moment that it wants to say this, but the church wants to say eventually that, and Nestorius is right about this, right? That Christ's two natures do not blend together in any way. And so what does this mean? Well, since your nature is what makes you the type of thing that you are, and all individual things fall into at least one type, then it actually seems impossible for one thing, to be two different types of thing without having a nature which is mixed together, right? Two different natures that are mixed together so that it can be unified, right? And so the conclusion that Nestorius draws is that Jesus is actually two separate things, right? A human thing and a divine thing. And the word, of course, for thing here in Greek is hypostasis, okay, which literally means substance, but from our standpoint, it means like an individual entity, okay, hypostasis. And so Nestorius is here claiming that Jesus is actually two hypostases, two different individual things. And for the sake of ease, we'll call one of them God because, he's God. And then we'll call the other one the Christ, okay, because the Christ is going to be a human who comes and is anointed by God, I guess. And so if Mary is the mother of something, she's probably the mother of the Christ thing and not the God thing, okay? She's probably the Christotokos, not the Theotokos. Now, we should add, of course, that, even if this is a position that you want to take, you're still probably committed as a Christian to the idea that Jesus, especially at this point in history, that Jesus is God, right? And so it's like, or that there was an incarnation, or that God became man to save us and die for us, etc., something like that, okay? And so how does Nestorius swing this? Well, basically, the word he likes to use is to say that the person or individual entity of Christ is conjoined to the individual entity of God, the second person of the Holy Trinity. And if you take that word joined very literally, and I don't think obviously you can't take it too literally because there's no actual glue involved, okay? But it should be taken relatively strongly, right? That it's actually like what it literally means. And what it means to join two things, like as a carpenter, is to attach them to each other, right? And so like imagine if you had a little statue of a human, a little statue of God, and I realize those two things probably look very similar if you were going to make a statue of God, and you glued them together, like along the back or something, okay? They are now stuck to each other, right? And in that sense, they're one, because you can't move one without moving the other, and they're stuck. But at the same time, right, they're separate things that are just stuck to each other. And so the unity is caused by this conjoining, this sticking of them together. Now, needless to say, because we're talking about a heresy, this is a problem. And the reason that it's a problem is that this thing, which is the conjunction of the Son of God and the Son of Mary, right? See what we're doing there. That's why this word Christotokos is important. This joining of the Son of God and the Son of Mary results, you would say, in a new thing, which is the conjunction of those two things. Like, right, if I glue a penny to a quarter, right, the penny is completely separated from the quarter in its nature. But the penny and the quarter now create this new entity which I can carry around, like a quarter penny, right? Or whatever we want to call it. We can call it a cransyphilitic if we want, right? But this new thing is somehow other than the penny and the quarter. And so I don't think Nestorius really wants to say this, but it is the implication of what it is he's saying, is that with the coming of the incarnation, there is created, as it were, and then again, this sounds contradictory, which is why it's a problem, a third entity, which is metaphysically on a higher level, both higher than the Son of Mary, the Christ, the human Jesus, but also higher than the divine Jesus. And that second part just seems wrong. Right? Now, it also seems wrong to say that there's one person with two minds and that there's one entity with two completely separated natures, but that seems less wrong. And additionally, right, if it's the case that Mary is not the mother of God because the Christ and God, the Son of Mary and the Son of God, are two separate things, then it's also the case that God didn't die and that God didn't really become man and that God didn't save us, but a human did. And we run into the Docetism problem again. Okay, so this is just, that's going to keep cropping up. So, needless to say, from everything I've said, people start to throw a fit, right? For all kinds of reasons, from everything from you're changing my Christmas carols to I'm actually an Apollinarian to you're from out of town and you're messing with our stuff to like the theological problems that I just described. And so people oppose him. People in his own diocese and then bishops from other places. Most notably will say Cyril of Alexandria, who finds himself becoming the hero in this story. And long story short, Nestorius is condemned at the Council of Ephesus. And he doesn't consider it a legitimate council because the people from Antioch didn't show up, and those would be, his homies. And again, stressing the humanity of Jesus to a significant degree. That's what the Antiochenes do. And Nestorius, rather than fighting it, is, quite happy to just retire and go back to his monastery, which is what he does before being exiled into northern Egypt, which is, needless to say, exceptionally ironic, where he dies. What Ephesus says, then, in contradiction to Nestorius, is what we've sort of already been hinting at, that Jesus is one person and therefore one thing, hypostasis, right? The hypostasis that Jesus is a person, perhaps amongst other things. And that one person, that one individual thing, has two separate minds. So it's a thing with a center of consciousness, but it has two. And that the reason that it's a person with two separate centers of consciousness is because it's a person with two separate natures. That is to say, it is one thing, which is two different types of thing, but is both of those things separately without being them together, the way that one human can be both Hispanic and male, because those are both like part of being human, and so you mix them. Okay, and you can kind of forgive Nestorius for a little bit, because if I'm perfectly honest, that seems super weird, if not nonsensical. The more I sit on it, the less I feel it's nonsensical and just super weird. But it feels nonsensical because there's certainly nothing else in all of existence, at least in created existence, that functions that way. And so it's about as difficult to accept as consubstantiality when it comes to the Trinity. But if you're going to have a God who becomes human, then it does seem to be the most reasonable of all positions, and it's the position the church takes. So there you go, because otherwise, again, you have this entity which is somehow above God, and you also have God not really being human, and that doesn't seem to work. And so this position that Jesus is one hypostasis, right, one individual thing, happens to be a person with two natures, a divine nature and a human nature, is what we call the hypostatic union, okay? Because the natures end up being united in this thing, which, like in the Nestorian model, seems to be in some sense metaphysically above them, but is not some new entity created from their conjunction, but is the eternal second person of the Trinity. And so those problems go away, and that allows you to say that the second person of the Trinity, because he's a human, dies on the cross, and the second person of the Trinity, because he is God, and so God dies on the cross. And of course, the necessary corollary of this is that God is also born of Mary, that Mary is the mother of God. Obviously not that she brought Jesus as God into existence, but that she brought him in his human nature into existence. But she brought that person as a human. And if that's a bit too much, you can at the very least say that she did certainly give birth to that person. And by virtue of giving birth to something is its mother. Okay? Now, there's one other historical note to mention, and then two sort of important contemporary, you would say, theological consequences of this. First, the historical note. What we have in Nestorianism, interestingly enough, is the first major schism in the church that is still existent today. Because Nestorius gets condemned and all of his followers are sort of required to flee the empire. And where do they flee? Well, they flee east into Persia, because to flee west would be to flee into the Atlantic, and that doesn't really work, or to flee north into the Germans, and plus they're already Aryan. And the Persians adopt Nestorius as a saint and as a doctor of the church, you would basically say. And so they have at least a Nestorian-like theology, and this results in a split between the church in Persia, which today is called the Assyrian Church of the East, and which is basically the sort of native Orthodox of Iran, that area, and India, and the rest of Christianity. And, there's a sort of kind way to look at this, which is simply that, the Nestorians showed up there and that they were, good preachers and holy men, and so that they simply converted these people to their position, and it was all in good faith. And then there's the jaded way of looking at it, which is basically to say that the Romans and the Persians hated each other, and that the Persians were, by all official religions, Zoroastrians, which we've discussed in previous videos, and they viewed the Christians, who shared the same religion in Persia, who shared the same religion as the Romans, with suspicious eye, right? Because maybe they aren't loyal and prefer a Christian leader and would rebel were Rome to invade, which it typically was doing because Persia and Rome are always at war on this border between them. And saying, no, we agree with Nestorius. We're totally different than those people. Gave the Christians in Persia, I should say, some please don't kill us faculties, right? And so that's sort of the jaded way of looking at why the Assyrian Church of the East adopted Nestorius as a theologian. Now, two important points from this historical reality for today. Well, the first is this. There are a whole bunch of Protestants, not every last Protestant, but there are a whole bunch of Protestants who are vehemently opposed to calling Mary the Mother of God. Now, they are not motivated by the same reasons Nestorius was motivated, because Nestorius was perfectly happy with having hymns to or about the Mother of God, or even he wouldn't call her that, but about Mary. So it was not about not honoring Mary. That was not his motivation. And the Protestant motivation is predominantly sort of this idea that Catholics place way too much emphasis on Mary and might be idolatrous and blah, 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 blah. Okay, and so they have completely different motivations, but there are a whole bunch of Protestants who will not refer to Mary as the Mother of God. And if you really want to say that she's not the Mother of God, but only the Mother of Jesus, which is what they usually prefer to say, sorry, but that means that Jesus isn't God. Because if Jesus is God, and Jesus is the son of Mary, then God is the son of Mary. That's how it works. And if you're going to deny that Mary gave birth to God, and that therefore Mary is the mother of God, then you're also denying that Jesus died on the cross, because if God didn't die as God, right? He died as a human. And so, like, totally refrain from calling Mary the Mother of God if you're a Protestant, and you think that the reason to refrain from doing it is because Catholics use it for idolatrous reasons. And, like, I totally get that. But you have to acknowledge personally, privately, not, out loud in liturgy, perhaps, that she is in fact the Mother of God. Otherwise, you run into serious incarnational problems. Even if you think that the phrase is used badly and so shouldn't be used, you have to acknowledge that on a fundamental level, it's a true statement. And here's the second implication of this, and I probably actually should have done this first, but whatever. Nestorius is the Patriarch of Constantinople. That means that he is the second most prominent bishop in the entire church. And within the context of that office, he is promulgating what he would consider, like official doctrine in relation to this position. And so, like, I'm all for filial submission to the leaders of the church. It's just important for certain radically traditionalist Catholics to remember that there is some nuance to that. Okay? Sometimes some bishops do get it wrong. And they can be very, very, very high bishops. I mean, we've seen, just a priest in the case of Arius, and then a major dealing bishop, you would say, in the case of Apollinarius. And now we've seen the second most important bishop in the church. We're going to see the third in our next heresy. And in the heresy after that, we're going to see the Pope. So it's, again, just something to keep in mind when considering the nature of the magisterium's capacity to serve as a epistemic guide and aid, which it certainly is, and should be considered as such. But outside of infallible statements, you do have to be discerning, especially if you have theological training, etc., etc. So anyway, there's that. That's the end of all I have to say about Nestorianism. I hope that you enjoyed, and comment, like, subscribe, etc., etc. And until next time, God bless and have a great day.